Hi everyone, welcome to our Transformative Talks, where we discuss all things transforming leadership. And today it's a great privilege to have Wendy Simpson OAM with us. Wendy's the chair of Wendys Group, a private investment company with experience in precision engineering, manufacturing, property development, venture capital investment and philanthropy, a really wide range of focal points. She's held key leadership roles across a number of industries, from airfreight, telecommunications, through to property investment. On top of this, she's been a tireless advocate for women in business and for female entrepreneurs. So it's appropriate that I'm interviewing Wendy on International Women's Day. Welcome, Wendy. It's great to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. It's a great privilege to be here and to be in conversation with you, as you said, on International Women's Day.
Great. Well, Wendy, perhaps we should start by having you tell us a little bit about your leadership journey and indeed your current leadership role.
Well, thank you very much. And what a journey I've been on. I started from a very humble family background, and people in our family didn't see themselves as leaders. So I started to read about leaders, and that was really the first set of leaders that I knew about was through reading books. And also being a woman of faith, I read about the leaders who really shaped our faith, great women and men in the Bible. And we were taught in Sunday school that we could be leaders, but the reality was that from a very humble working class family, many of us weren't being encouraged to be leaders in society. So there was quite a transformation in my life when the women's liberation movement and Germaine Greer started to write and say that women are the future. And so I started to read the Bible in one hand, New Testament, and also the women's liberation movement material, and just realised that not only could a humble girl from the working class suburbs of Melbourne become a leader, but as a woman I could become a leader as well. And so I had to make a shift in my attitude. I had to find new role models, because those around me weren't aspiring to some of the things that I believed. Because there was something inside me, a spark inside me that said, you can make a difference. And a very interesting group of women called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who were the pioneers who fought for women to get the vote in Australia, were one of my inspirations. So Frances Willard was a real pioneer, and she was an American woman who really inspired me, and I read a lot of her material. So there would be very few women in Australia, I would say, that have come from a working class background who read about Frances Willard and became a prominent woman leader in Australia. But that's been my journey.
Great, thanks, Wendy. It's interesting. You mentioned the women's liberation movement, literature, Germaine Greer, right through the 70s, and I have to admit that a lot of male church leaders were very threatened by this initiative and by the literature. But you saw some connection between your Christian faith and what these ladies were saying at that time.
I did, yes, and I think that was my challenge, was to find these role models, because, as you said, if you looked in working class, people didn't aspire to be leaders. We were very sectorial in those days in Australia, and not many working class people did rise up, maybe in the trade union movement, that's about it. And so if I wanted to be the person that God had called me to be, I really had to search, as I said, far and wide. But because there was that spark in me, I didn't say, well, that's it. And so, there's a saying, it can't be what you can't see. And I said, well, what happens if you're a pioneer? You have to be able to see something that doesn't exist and believe that it can. And so that was my faith. That was, Ephesians 3:20 says that now unto him who's able to do far more than we ask or imagine. So my imagination was inspired by reading the gospel and understanding that I could be something that I couldn't see, but I believed it because I believe God's word's true.
Yeah. That's great, Wendy. I think one of the throwaway lines, and very common lines we hear about leadership, is that leadership begins with a vision. I think we all agree, actually, a significant component of leadership is having a vision, somewhere you want to go or you want to take us, that's better than where we are at this point in time. And I think you're describing that there. You had a vision of something better for Christian women. You went on and had quite a number of very significant leadership roles in industry and even connection with government. Tell us a tiny bit about that.
Yes, I was asked to be a ministerial advisor in initially the John Cain era and then the Joan Kirner era. She was the first female Premier of the state of Victoria. And so I got to see the work ethic. It's a hot topic in Australia at the moment, being a political staffer and what you're asked to do and the long hours that you work and whether you're involved in these political roles because you have a sense of service, or is there a sense of the glamour and the sparkle of being, really in on the deals that are being made to shape our nation? And so, I had to wrestle with those very issues as well. What is motivating me? Why do I want to be part of some of the political machinery that help decide the future of Australians? But again, my faith informed me that why shouldn't Christians be there helping to shape policy, helping to shape the things that are important to our nation? So I got to see how politics works, the good, the bad and the ugly. It was a really important time in my life. And just to see how Joan led as a woman was pretty important and rare. And actually her first leadership role was at the Presbyterian Youth Fellowship. And she said she attributed a lot of her confidence as a leader back to those days. She came back to her faith. I went to her funeral, and that was a very inspiring Christian funeral. So my other encouragement is keep praying for our political leaders, because many of them did start off being inspired by God to take on these roles, and then they get caught up in all of the activity of being a politician, and it's a 24-hour cycle, and it is so intense, and they can often lose their way. But I kept praying for her, and I know a number of others did, and she came back to faith. So that's the Joan Kirner story. Yes, and I've had also leadership roles where I was engaged with the Chinese government to bring the internet to China. So I was very privileged to sit around the table with the leaders of the nation of China to discuss what the internet would mean to them. What does it mean to have information widely available to the people of the great nation of China? And then I was the Trade Commissioner for the Victorian Government, and took John Landy, the famous Olympian who was the State Governor of the State of Victoria, around China to discuss the ethics of gold medals and whether a nation like China, when it was hosting the 2008 Olympics, whether they should try and win gold medals at all costs. So I've been very privileged to have the inner circle discussions with politicians at state level and national and international level.
Wendy, that's a varied leadership experience, really. You've, as you said, been very privileged to connect to quite different contexts in which leadership is exercised. I wonder, reflecting upon all of your experiences, do you have a definition or a description of leadership, and perhaps even some thoughts on what qualities make someone an effective leader?
Yes, Stephen, look, I think there are some eternal truths in leadership, but I think currently in today's society there's some fresh insights in them. So I think the eternal truths are that we need to be, as the Bible says, we need to be humble, we need to understand, as we talked about before, why has God called us to do? What is our specific role that we're going to play in the leadership of the sphere of influence that God's called us to? And I do believe we're called to be specific leaders. So whatever sphere of influence I'm in, I do pray for that sector, whether it's a political, whether it's airfreight, with telecommunications. I pray for those industries. I pray for the other leaders in that sector. That's the sphere that I'm in at that time. But also, I think now the ability to say I got it wrong, that maybe my first approach wasn't right, to sit back and listen and learn first, rather than speak first. I grew up in the era where we were talking earlier that women thought that they had to become like men in order to be seen as leaders because there was only one model of leadership. And I think we're seeing now that being able to say, I'm sorry, there's been some recent developments in Australia where leaders have to say sorry. In the Rio Tinto example, if people can't say sorry and they defend their position, they defend their organisation, and they don't realise the hurt and the damage they've caused, that is very poor leadership. But being able to be humble and apologise is not an easy thing for a lot of leaders. And so I think that's the fresh take, that we can say that we want to be leaders. There's a lot of books written about leadership, perhaps in that more command and control style of leadership, that fearless, out front, almost, army style, military hero leader. But I think society now, where opinions are so divided, where we've got the recent US elections now, we need leaders who can pull people together, who can say, yes, you've had your strong opinions, but for the greater good, we need to be able to work together. As we become more fractured and people become more well entrenched in their positions, it's a true leader that really works with the Holy Spirit to understand how are we going to get everyone behind this new idea and come together. And so that does require listening and learning what are the nuances. I think leadership isn't quite as black and white as it used to be. It needs to be a lot more nuanced. And so in this era now where the populace is very well educated, people also, in addition to being well educated, have these ways of getting news feeds which solidify their view, which means that they're not often hearing the other views. So it's the leader that has to listen to many views and discern and distill what's the right way, and then present their idea in a way that these groups that they're dealing with understand how it's going to make sense. Because sadly, people are often living in their little silos now. With the way the news feeds are set up, people can hear just what they want to hear, and they don't hear the big idea, the great idea that's better for the whole of society. They just hear about what's good for their group. And that is a real leadership challenge, I think, how to bring everyone together and move forward when it's something where everyone has to compromise a little bit to get the greater good.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Listening to you, and that's a great answer, very comprehensive answer. I think you've made the point that leadership is very contingent on circumstances. Circumstances are subject to constant change. The level of information available to anybody now is immense. So leaders need to be consultative. I think you used the word humble a number of times. Spiritual, certainly. Relational, I think, might capture quite a number of those things. And I think we'd all agree about that. It's interesting to contemplate that the original theory of leadership is the great man theory. A great man, by the way. And, it goes back to Victorian times and pre-Victorian times when wealthy white men got the chance to reflect on history and looked at Napoleon and looked at Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. And yet I still think that there's some of that around the place. If you read the media at times, often the implicit theory of leadership, there is the great man theory. So, the dominant authoritarian character, and everyone just looks at that person in awe and does what they're told. Have you encountered any of that type of leadership, and do you think it's in any way effective now, or it's really way out of date? Yeah.
Well, I think one of the challenges in the very early days of my leadership development was for women to be recognised as leaders. There was a seminar I went to where they said, just close your eyes and imagine an electrician, a plumber, a politician. They just listed these roles off, and then they said, describe those people that you've seen, and they all were men. You're right. So what we're saying nowadays is that, electricians and plumbers and leaders and politicians don't have to be just men. They can be women too. However, relearning what it means to be a leader for society, I think it is both men and women have to rethink things. So when men are thinking about how to bring talent through, if they just find people who look like them, then they will bring up all the young men in the organisation. And when I first joined QBE Insurance, they told me about the Young Lions group. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Who are the Young Lions? Well, they're the next generation of leaders at QBE Insurance. And I said, oh, really? So am I a young lion? I said, no, you can't be one because you're a woman. And so I said, well, I think we're going to have to fix that, aren't we? So I started the QBE Women's Group. And I was very fortunate to find that Frank Blunt had brought Debbie King across from Motorola University into Telstra Australia, and he'd started the Telstra Women's Group. And so we collaborated between QBE Insurance and Telstra, and QBE was eventually the first listed company on the Australian Stock Exchange to have 3 women directors. So I planted the seed early there. But the idea that that one person can know it all and be the greatest leader, I think we've seen it in the banking industry in Australia, where there was a lot of the one person is the key face of the business, and they run everything. We've seen the weaknesses of that. So yes, I think society is changing, and the idea that one person can know it all, and there needs to be decisions made eventually. If there can't be an agreement in the group, then one person who is the leader has to say, having heard all, on the balance of everything I've heard, we're going to do this.
Yeah.
It does need to be done. But there's a difference between a person coming into the room and said, I've been on the holy mountain, I've heard it all, I know everything, and we're doing this. And the group will go, yes, sir, we're doing that. Versus that, let's consider everything, let's draw on the wisdom of the leadership team. And then the leader says, having heard all, having discussed it all and thought of this, the implications and the unintended consequences that might occur, this is the way we need to go forward. Yeah, there is a difference.
Yeah. Thanks, Wendy. You talked about some initiatives in QBE and Telstra, I think, in regard to developing women as leaders or bringing them through as leaders. Do you think women lead differently to men? What differences have you observed?
Yes. Look, I think, Stephen, one of the interesting things is, first of all, the number of leaders. There aren't as many women leaders as men. And so one of the challenges is to see that pioneering women are not necessarily the representation of all women. So if you're not a glass ceiling breaking kind of woman, does that mean you can't be a leader? So in my early years of development, the only women leaders were glass ceiling breaking kind of women. So that was how they got to be leaders, was that they were prepared to continue to back themselves, to push forward, and they wouldn't let go until they were given their leadership opportunity. I think now we've got more women leaders, and so that's important to see that it doesn't have to be that aggressive, push yourself forward type of woman. I think one of the other things is that once women get into positions, so there's the getting to be a leader, getting to be recognised and respected, and then once you're there, what do you do? And so I think that's the second part of your question. When you are affirmed, you're completely secure as a leader, there's no one trying to push you out of your role, then what can you achieve as a woman leader? And I think the culture of an organisation is something that women think about a lot. They think about how to make workplaces an employer of choice. There's often the flexible working arrangements that women will be champions of in the workplace. And then there's the discussion about, how do we measure and evaluate our employees? I think a lot of the women leaders that I know are challenging those. How do we measure performance? So I think once women are in the leadership roles, in addition to discussing performance in the traditional way, they bring in new performance measures so that we're holistic in how we evaluate employees and contributors. And I think finally the other thing is the thinking intergenerationally. What kind of leaders do we need in the future? And staff training, those things often are the conversations that women want to initiate when they come into an organisation. They say, well, what are we doing about our employee development? And that's a great conversation to have as well.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. So really perhaps more collegial, more willing to create pathways for others. Perhaps you've seen in women leaders than in men leaders, typically male leaders. What advice would you give for women leaders at the moment, or indeed for men working with women in leadership positions?
Yes, well, I did spend some time in China, and I was shaped by the culture there. Mao said that women hold up half the sky. So I think the first thing is to say that it takes a whole business community to raise up the business leaders. So it takes men to recognise the talent of women. It takes the women also to recognise their own talent. So it is not just a women's issue, it is everyone's issue. That it is sad in some ways that the Communist Party in China were more willing and more early adopters in raising up women leaders than often our Western nations. So when I was living there from 1999 to 2006, I found that my leadership was much more celebrated and respected and honoured than it had been in my roles heading up TNT and QBE in Australia. So that was quite a shock that it was so well respected and celebrated. So I think we can learn to do that. I mean, it is International Women's Day, so we do a shout out to all the women, and we can celebrate. Let's look at ways that we can celebrate the contribution that women make. So I'd like to send a message to all our leaders, not just the women, but also women to believe when there's an opportunity to consider putting yourself into that opportunity. When I was running the Women Entrepreneur Program, a Springboard, which is the premier program for women wanting to raise $1 million or more, we needed to tap women 4 times on the shoulder before they would accept a position in the program. So there is still some work to be done that women think, well, but you really mean me? Yes, we do. So when, as society, as business leaders, we see a talented woman and she's a little reluctant and says, I'm not sure that's for me, don't accept that. I think our role is to say, yes, you can. I believe in you. Come on, have a go. So it is a partnership with the women, recognising their own talent, but also the rest of us in society saying, let's go out there and look for the future leaders and make sure that we're always looking for women. What I say is when you get invited to an important business event, take a young woman along with you, because they need to see how these things operate. They need to be in the room, seeing how other leaders operate. And often it's very hard for women to get a seat at the table. It's very hard for them to get invited into these inner circles. So I encourage people to take a young woman along so that they can see how leadership is done in both formal and informal settings.
Yeah, well, fabulous advice there, Wendy. Well, finally, and we could talk all day, you've got so much insight, but I've listened to you and you've connected your Christian faith very much to your leadership journey, right from the very first aspirations to be a leader to where you are today. Do you think there's anything distinctive about Christian leadership? What value does your Christian faith bring to your leadership?
Yes, absolutely. So we talked about that sort of the heroic leader that comes into the room with the brilliant solution. So when we really understand the gospel, we understand that it's not up to us, that our life is not our own, and that Jesus came to show us how to understand our true purpose, and that is to walk hand in hand with him. So it takes the pressure off, because if we are the great one that has all the answers. When we do get it wrong, then we say, well, it's all about us, so we must have failed. So while successes are great when you're the heroic leader, the failures are very deep, and we've seen so many examples of leaders who've fallen and have taken a long time to recover because they thought it was all about them. So the strength of my faith helps me to go through the difficult times, and I think that's so important. Leadership can be a lonely journey. There's some things you can't discuss with your team, and so that's why the Holy Spirit is such a great partner in the leadership journey.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful, Wendy. Thank you. It's been really insightful to listen to you today, and as I said a moment ago, I think we could listen all day. Look, I greatly appreciate your insights. I pray God's blessing on your family and on your endeavours. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Stephen, and greetings to everyone in the Alpha Christmas community.
Thank you. Thanks everyone else for joining us and watching this transformative talk. I hope you found it helpful. I hope at least you appreciate the women in your life, the potential that they bring to your circumstance, to your organisation, and the future leaders or the current leaders you have in your midst. So encourage them and give them the opportunity they deserve. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.